So I'm going to start today just giving an overview of bats and some of the interesting things that they do, and to be able to show, if I get my tech working, to be able to show some of the fascinating things they do and what we need to protect them. Bats are an amazing group of our fauna. I think they're absolutely fascinating. Sometimes they get portrayed negatively, which is really unfortunate, and often they're poorly understood. But I always love this photo of this very cheesy grin Gould's wattle bat, because I always think, how could you resist a cheesy grin smile on a bat like this? So they're amazing little creatures, really beneficial, and we need to know more about them. So we've got two groups of our bats. We've got the large flying foxes, or the fruit-eating bats, and we'll hear a lot more about those after the break. But in summary, we've got two main species. The predominant ones are the grey-headed flying foxes, and they're quite large, up to about can be up to about 1 kilogram, feeding on fruit and nectar. They make amazing long distance movements, throughout Victoria and interstate, and form quite large camps, which often means that they come close to where people are living, and there's sometimes management issues. And Rod and Layla will talk a lot more about flying foxes later on, but they're often the groups of bats that people know a bit more about because they're a lot more obvious and people can see them. Whereas what I've worked for 40 years on, and my passion, is the smaller insectivorous bats. These are small, they're often quite cryptic, hidden away in roosts during the day, only coming out at night, largely silent to our ears, but use their high-frequency echolocation call to be able to navigate around amazingly well. And I think often why people don't know that there's many bats around is because of how small they are, and how, people often think that, they're a moth or something. And this is a photo of the little forest bat sitting on the end of my thumb, and it's weighing only 4 grams, and that's less than the weight of a 10-cent piece. So that's the smallest species in Victoria, but we get ones that are quite tiny, and so often hidden and not very well known. So we've got quite high diversity of bats in Victoria, and they occur across all habitats throughout Victoria, so all the forested areas, the farmland areas and urban areas. We've got 24 species, which is often a surprise to people, thinking that we might only have a couple. Some of those are really quite common and widespread, like the lesser long-eared bat, that's basically spread throughout all of Victoria, and in fact virtually all of Australia. And other species are quite rare and specialised, such as the eastern horseshoe bat, only very restricted range in eastern Victoria. And we've got 5 species that are listed as threatened, including the eastern horseshoe bat. And some of these are very rare. Probably the rarest one is the southeastern long-eared bat, and until recently it was only known from one area within Victoria. It's a bit more widespread in New South Wales and southern Queensland, but within Victoria it was only known until recently from one area, very small area that you can see by the circle there, west of Hatter in the Nowinji area. And from some genetic work that we did and some mark recapture work, we thought that there could be as few as 50 individuals in this population. And like I say, was the only known population in Victoria. And these are occurring in a patch of really old growth mallee, and we don't have a lot of old growth mallee in Victoria. So this Nowinji area is extremely special, and maintaining the old growth mallee there and protecting it from fire is so critically important. But excitingly, recently we've just been getting some new records of the southeastern long-eared bat, much further south than what we had recorded before. There was one record right down southwest of it, or west of Echuca, but just recently there's been some records in the Gumbower area in black box habitat, which is quite a different habitat to what they're in up in the Mallee. So it shows, even though we've been working on bats and been looking at this species for a while, there's still new surprises and new things being found, extending their distribution a lot further. So it's very exciting to always be learning new things about these species. And another one that's even more specialised is the golden tip bat. And it hadn't been known from Victoria. It had only been known down the east coast of Australia, up to within 2 kilometres of the Victorian border, so pretty close. But in 2022, we managed to record them just over the border in Victoria, in some rainforests in far east Gippsland, and so that was exciting to get a new species of bat for Victoria. And why it's so specialised is that it hovers in front of spider webs, picking spiders out of spider webs, and that's all it eats, just spiders. And it roosts in disused hanging birds' nests, so the deeply hanging ones. So it's quite different to what most bats are, but it just shows the sort of specialisation of some species. Now, even though we've got more bats around than what people may think, there's still a wide range of threats to the bats, and they can be affecting them in different ways. So the threats might affect where they're roosting, what they're feeding on, and the other third major requirement that they've got is access to free water. It could also be predation or other reasons for mortality, and then climate change is exacerbating all of that. So in flight, these bats are amazing. They're flying around, catching a really wide range of small flying invertebrates, mostly insects, but a few other things as well. And they can eat a huge amount. So they're eating largely moths, beetles, bugs, those sorts of things, and they can consume up to half their body weight in insects in a night. So if you put that in a human context, that's a bit scary how much they can eat. But because of that, they're really important in maintaining a balance in insect numbers. And they chew their food really well. So this is just an example of a lesser long-eared eating a mealworm, which is what we feed them on when they're in captivity. But you can see how they munch through their food amazingly well, just finely chewed up insect remains. But most of us will be aware that there's been a massive decline in insect numbers over recent years, and a real concern globally that insect numbers are really going down, and there's some estimates of a 1 to 2% decline per year. So we really don't, all of these bats are totally dependent on insect availability, and that is often a really key knowledge gap of what we don't fully understand for a lot of these species. So, what are they feeding on? And importantly, what's the availability of those primary prey sources? So it's something we really need to get a lot more information on. And of course, there's going to be changes over time with climate change. More droughts, more severe weather is only going to make that worse. Now, where they fly also puts them at risk of other things. So some species have got short, broad wings, like the lesser long-eared. That means they're very manoeuvrable and often fly low to the ground. And unfortunately, cats are a really big issue for species that fly low to the ground. This photo is an example actually from New Zealand, but all of those bats were from this cat's stomach apparently, so that's pretty scary. And at the other end of the spectrum, white-striped free-tail bats in particular, but other species that have got long, narrow wings, which means they're built for speed and distance. They're flying around in the open fairly high above the canopy often. And this, unfortunately, puts them at risk from collisions with wind farms. Wind farms are causing mortalities to bats, we're still trying to understand how much of a risk that is, and trying to do a lot of research at the moment to be able to work out how to mitigate that risk, because obviously we want to support renewable energy, but we want to make sure that it doesn't come as a cost to our wildlife. So that's certainly an area of emerging research that we're wanting to learn a lot more about. Now, where the bats roost can also result in threats. So we've got bats that roost in caves and bats that roost in tree hollows. And the threats to the cave roosting bats, there's 4 species that roost in caves in Victoria. The southern bent-winged bat and the eastern bent-winged bat are both listed as critically endangered in Victoria, and they are so dependent on just a small number of maternity sites. Within Victoria, there's only 2 southern bent-winged bat maternity sites and another one in South Australia at Narracourt. And in Victoria, at least, only 1 maternity site for eastern bent-winged bats. They occur further up the coast, up to the top of Australia, so they've got more maternity sites outside of Victoria, but in Victoria there's only 1 maternity site. So those 2 sites are absolutely critically important. Hold on. Sorry, my voice is going cracky. And so you can imagine if the bats are just in these caves are so critical, they can be really severely impacted by disturbance and by people going into caves. So when we go into caves to study these bats, we use low impact techniques. We use thermal imaging cameras, which you can see here, where a photo of a person where they pick up the heat of somebody, so you can do it in the complete darkness, and also infrared cameras or really low red light. Now, the thermal cameras are amazing. They can show so much, and this is just some footage of some bats in the maternity cave at Warrnambool, where you can see all the little light dots are where the bats are roosting, and the other ones are where they're flying. So it's a great technique to be able to observe the bats without disturbing them. And we can use this technique to be able to monitor numbers, so being able to count the numbers of bats as they're flying out of the cave. And so this footage is, this footage is where the bat's coming out of a different cave, and the red is the bat, the heat of the bat, and the blue is the sort of trailing heat of the bat as it's coming out. And by using motion tracking software that we've developed, and Amanda Bush, who works with me at ARI, has been fantastic in developing this up, able to use this automated system to be able to count the numbers so that we can start getting really accurate population estimates. Now, we also want to know what the breeding success is, and so it's often more difficult to be able to count the number of pups that are born, particularly in caves that are really, really large. And so the pups are born about a third the size of the mother, so they're really quite large. So there's a huge maternal investment in the pups, and they all roost together in a crate and jiggle around like mad, and you can even see some yawning in there. And so they're all tightly packed in together to increase the heat and humidity to mean that they can grow quicker. But unfortunately, recently we've been getting some events where there's been a large number of pups dying, and at both the eastern and southern bent-winged bat maternity sites. And we're still not totally sure what's causing this, but it could be 20 to 30% of the pups from a year. They only breed once a year, have a single young a year. And so it's really quite a concern as to what's causing this mortality. So we're doing extensive research on southern bent-winged bat, but also eastern bent-wing, to be able to more fully understand what the risks are, because for a critically endangered species, we really need to be able to understand so that we can turn those risks around recover the species. And we've got a very active recovery team as well, which is fantastic. And Emmy's going to talk in more detail about southern bentwing bat and some of her fantastic research on it. Now, another emerging threat is the risk of white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that's native to Europe that's been spread to North America, and it's a cave-dwelling fungus that likes cold caves. And in North America, it's killed over 6 million bats since it was introduced inadvertently there in 2006. So it is decimating populations. Some populations have been reduced by 96%. So it's wiping, it's causing common species to be highly threatened now. And it can be spread by the bats as they move between the caves. So we've got to understand movement patterns in terms of how much they're moving around, but also people can spread it on gear as they're moving from cave to cave. And so that's something that we're really actively trying to encourage people to know more about this and to prevent that spread. As far as we know, it's not yet in Australia, but we're really concerned that it could have a major impact, particularly on the bentwing bats that roost in reasonably cool climates, in cool caves where the fungus would grow, perfect conditions for the fungus. So we're looking at what species would be most impacted, what the impact would be, and how to mitigate this. So this is a real concern, and we encourage, if anybody's going overseas in caves, please be aware of this and not use the same gear that you used overseas, and disinfect everything, because we desperately need to keep white nose syndrome out of Australia. Now, the treehole roosting bats have got a different range of threats, and we get a lot of most of our species roost in tree hollows as opposed to caves, and big old trees with hollows are critical, whether they're big old live trees like this Gould's wattlebat roost that typically dead spout on a big live tree, or big old dead trees. And dead trees are so important as habitat for bats. I can't stress that as much, too much. Things like that small crack on this dead tree here had 36 lesser long-eared females and their young coming out of that crack. Now, most people think of hollows, the big hollows being the most important. Even narrow cracks on dead trees are really critically important. And so anywhere possible, if you can, protect your big old dead trees. And unfortunately, we're losing more and more of those, whether it be in farming areas intentionally from putting in pivot irrigation systems, for example, or this example where a stubble burn got out of control and burnt a big old tree, or whether it be in forested areas or in urban areas where we're losing our big old trees. They're just so important. So if there's any way of protecting both big old live trees and dead trees, it's so critical, because in a lot of areas they're not being replaced. So in a lot of our farmland areas, there's no regeneration coming up. We've still got the remnant big old trees left from a couple of hundred years of clearing, that they're still there, but they're going to be senescing and dying out naturally, or through intentional clearing over the next sort of 50 years or so. And even where there's fantastic efforts to do revegetation or some natural regeneration, that's so critical, but those trees are going to take 100 years or more to develop hollows big enough to support our bat fauna. So it's so critical that we get that regeneration happening, but that we hang on to our big old trees for as long as possible, so that we can keep the hollows for the bats. And in urban environments, there's a lot of the same threats, but also some additional ones. But it's amazing how many bats we do get in our urban environments. And this is, I've used the numbers here for Melbourne, but the same occurs in regional cities and certainly in towns. And in Melbourne, we've got 16 or 17 species, depending on where you draw the boundary of Greater Melbourne, and at least 6 species right in the middle of Melbourne. And so bats have been one of our group of our fauna that have been able to cope with coexisting in urban environments a lot more than what a lot of other species. And as you'll hear from Rodney and Layla, the flying foxes certainly do that as well. But what we found is parks and gardens with big old trees are really critical, and loss of hollow-bearing trees for safety purposes, that is a real issue. Now, I know for safety purposes, some, dead limbs need to be taken off, but if it's possible at all to leave dead limbs on, that would really help. And light pollution is also an issue for some species. Some species are attracted to lights because they're attracted to the insects that are around lights, whereas other species are very, they don't like being around lights, and you get much lower levels of activity where you've got lights. And so, modifying how lighting is done is an important way to help increase the number of bats we can get in Melbourne or in cities. So what can you do to help? We've still got quite a lot of bats around, which is fantastic, but they still have lots of threats. So there's things that you can do, as I've mentioned, protecting big old trees with hollows, both dead and live, in all sorts of situations. Revegetation, particularly growing plants that attract insects, particularly moths, because moths are a very large component of most species' diet. Now, natural hollows can be supplemented by bat boxes. We always stress it needs to be supplemented, not replace. You can never replace a big old tree with hollow, but bat boxes can be useful in some situation. They're usually dominated by Gould's wattlebats, the most common species in urban environments, but a range of other species can use them. Started experimenting with chainsaw hollows, which are being really successful for other species, but haven't had as much success for bats, but that's an area that will be interesting to see how that develops. Keeping cats inside. Cats are a real issue for a lot of these bats. And then for the cave-dwelling bats, avoid going into caves to reduce the disturbance factor, and don't bring in caving gear from overseas. So I'll leave it there. Just the key take-home messages. Bats are more common and diverse than what often people think, and they really play really important ecosystem roles, but there are a range of threats that we need to really manage and reduce those threats to make sure they can still persist, and changing people's attitudes is one of those critical things that will help with that. And while we've increased our knowledge hugely over the last few decades, there's still so many things that we don't know. So continuing learning and implementing that learning is critically important. So I'll leave it there and we can go to questions. Just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Lindy. That was a fantastic overview, and I had all those questions. You just kept answering my questions. But we've got a few more in the chat. So Maren wanted to know how you distinguish between different species. Do you use harp traps, or are you able to use the calls?
Yes, I didn't go into detail with the call recognition. So for other people, the standard technique that we've used in the past is catching them with harp traps or sometimes mist nets. And we still do that in certain situations because it's important sometimes to be able to know what animal, definitely what species you've got, or wanting to look at body condition, age, sex, those sorts of things, or wanting to catch them to put transmitters on them. But increasingly, we're going towards using their high-frequency echolocation call to be able to remotely record them so that we don't always need to catch them. And we're making great progress in working out how to tell all the species apart. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of species that overlap in their calls, and so it's not always possible to tell all calls apart. And there's some species like the long-eared bats, their calls are all very similar, or southern bent-winged bats overlap with 4 other species in their calls. But it's something we're using a lot of artificial intelligence approaches at the moment to be able to try and, really increase the accuracy of using automated approaches, because you can collect huge amounts of data using bat detectors, but the key thing is then trying to analyse it all. So it's another area of active research that we're making progress on, but we're not totally there yet.
Cool, thank you. There was also a few questions about tea on insects. So Jerry wanted to know if there's evidence of bats feeding on bogong moths, because that's a critical food source for the mountain peepee possum.
Yep, they certainly eat bogong moths, when they're available. How much they depend on them, and so how much the bogong moth decline will be impacting them, we don't really know. We've only recently been able to start using genetic techniques for getting down to actual species in terms of the identification. Previously, we could only go, they're eating moths or beetles or bugs, but using DNA now, we can look at that in a lot more detail, but we've only had a few studies on that, so there's a lot more still to work out. But yeah, the bogong moth thing's a really interesting one, but yeah, they certainly eat those. They're a really nice size for a bat.
Yeah. Someone's also asked, are there any resources about which plants are great for moth habitat and creating ideal microbat habitat?
Yeah, the plants is, I'm just shifting your screen. It's really, the plants are very much whatever attracts moths, largely moths and beetles, but moths is such a key one, and we don't have a full species list of what the ideal things are. But if there's any way of being able to work out what moths are, what's going to help moths, that's what's going to help the bats.
Yeah. Someone wants to know about recommendations of where to get a bat box, because they've got a big tree in their backyard, but it doesn't yet have hollows and cracks, so as an alternative.
Yeah, there are a few people that provide, make bat boxes. What you want with a bat box is to have quite thick timber, not the really thin plywood. They get far too hot. So you're wanting a thick timber that's well sealed, an opening at the bottom. So there are a few, commercial places, or there's places like men's sheds that will often make them. I don't have any specific recommendation of a company to go to, I'm sorry.
That's all right. There are a few about wind farms. I might actually leave that for a next talk, because it might. But we've also got, with the survival rates of pups, and is there any chance it could be related to some disease that we don't know about?
We've had them tested by vets at the zoo, and they can't find anything pathologically that's gone wrong, and we still don't know, but sometimes it seems like they're just falling off the roof. They're in a part of the cave that's really, really loose, crumbly rock, and so we've seen some, as they're jostling around, just straight falling off the roof and then not being able to get back up again. Now, it could be as simple as that, but I'm still not totally sure on that. And also, if it is that, having people coming into the cave, that's a greater risk as well. So, yeah.
Andy Arnold wants to know if there's any bat monitoring being done in the visitors' caves, such as Buchan Caves or Princess Margaret Caves, and whether disease is an issue there as well.
Yeah, certainly the risk of white nose syndrome, if it gets into Australia, moving around between those, certainly will be a risk. Now, hopefully we can keep it out of Australia, but places like that. We're not doing much. We're doing a bit at Bucket, and Tony Mitchell in East Gippsland is keeping track of some of those sites. The place that there's the most monitoring done at a cave is over at Narracoorte in South Australia. So if anybody wants to go, to be able to see the bats inside through infrared cameras that are in the cave, it's just an amazing setup over there. But yeah, we need to do more monitoring at some of these caves, and there's various projects looking at cavers' attitudes and visitors' attitudes when they're coming to parks, and trying to ask them, if they've come from overseas and things like that, in terms of keeping the gear, the biosecurity, the gear clean side of it. So,
yeah. Cool. Thank you. A few more research questions. Someone's wondering whether any work with eDNA for identifying bats has been done.
That's a really interesting one. There's some amazing work being done overseas, and it's been trialled once up in Queensland, of getting eDNA out of the air and being able to work out what species are in a cave, for example, by just taking some of the air. And I just think that's amazing. But they're able to it looks like they're being able to identify, particularly in a cave situation. They say they can even do it out in the open, but I think air movements and everything. But anyway, yeah, that's another emerging field that'll be fascinating to see what we can do or what can be done in that area.
And speaking of open spaces, so Anne has asked, in totally cleared landscape, what is the distance that a bat can travel from their roost for feeding?
Really interesting question. It depends on the species. So in quite a lot of farmland work that we did up in northern Victoria, we were finding the bats moving up to 13 kilometres from roost site to foraging area. So they were roosting in Barmah, coming out into farmland to feed. More recent work on southern bentwing bats, we've found they're going even much greater distances than that. So these bats can fly a long way, 10s, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometres potentially, depending on the species. So they can, but most foraging is close to trees. So they'll move across open landscapes, and some species can feed totally in the open, but most foraging depends on being close to trees. And so having trees in the landscape, they might fly across, but then a lot of the foraging is around the trees.
Yeah. Julia's asked just for you maybe to elaborate a bit more on, or provide your thoughts on the emergence of new bat species appearing in Victoria, like the golden tipped.
Yeah, so the golden tip bat, my guess is it was always there and people just hadn't found it. It's quite a difficult species to catch, and so my guess is that, interesting with climate change, some species are coming further south, and so it's always a possibility that it's changed in its distribution, but to some extent, it's just you need to be in the right place and looking with the right techniques and being able to find it. So, and because it had been recorded 2 kilometres in, over the border, and we found it another 2 kilometres in Victoria, it wasn't, a huge range, but there was a Victorian border in between.
Yeah.